It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I decided to stop by the bank. I had been meaning to cash a check for some time, but work and life had kept me too busy. The check was from an old client of mine, one who had appreciated the work I had done for them, and I was grateful for it. Little did I know that simple errand would lead to a moment that would forever change my perception of people and power. I'd always known that the world could be unfair, but there was something about the way certain people treated me that made it feel even more personal. As a Black woman, I'd often encountered subtle prejudice, whether it was in the workplace, on the street, or more often than not, in settings that seemed innocent enough. Banks were supposed to be neutral spaces, places of business, yet I had already experienced my fair share of discomfort in them. Long lines, indifferent service, and the occasional condescending look from a teller when I made a simple transaction. But that day felt different. The bank was relatively quiet as I walked through the glass doors. The soft hum of conversations and typing filled the air as people went about their business. I approached the counter and greeted the teller, a young man in his mid-20s with a smile. "Good afternoon," I said politely. "I'd like to cash a check, please." He looked up at me, his expression blank. I could tell immediately he wasn't exactly eager to help, but I didn't think much of it. After all, customer service isn't always a warm experience, especially during the lunch rush. I handed him the check and my ID, expecting a smooth transaction. The teller took the check and studied it carefully, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we cannot cash this check," he said, his voice cold and distant. I blinked, caught off guard. "Why not?" I asked, my voice a bit more assertive now. He glanced at me, and then at the check again, almost like he was examining it under a microscope. "There's an issue with the signature," he replied, his tone dismissive. Now, I knew my client's signature was clean and legitimate. There was no way the check was invalid. I had cashed checks like this one before, without any issues. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think that's the problem. The signature is perfectly fine." He gave me a patronizing smile, as if I were a child who didn't understand the basics of banking. "It's not about the signature. It's just that we can't process this right now." I felt my frustration bubbling up. Something about the way he spoke to me, it wasn't just dismissive, it felt like he was questioning my intelligence. My instinct told me something wasn't right. I stood there for a moment, gathering my thoughts. "Can I speak to the manager?" I asked, trying to stay calm. The teller sighed dramatically, like I was making an unnecessary fuss. "Sure, I'll call her." He picked up the phone and spoke to someone on the other end in a low voice, his eyes never leaving me. The look he gave me, it was one I had seen before. It wasn't the look of someone who was genuinely trying to help, it was the look of someone who had already made up his mind about me. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 40s approached the counter. She had a stern expression, her arms crossed as if she were already prepared for a confrontation. This was the manager, I assumed. I introduced myself and explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was growing more frustrated by the second. "I don't understand," I said. "I've cashed checks here before and everything is in order. Why is there a problem with this one?" The manager looked at the check, then at me. Her gaze lingered on my face for a moment, sizing me up. "I'm afraid I can't help you either. There's a policy regarding checks from certain accounts. We need further verification," she said, her tone matter of fact. I could feel my patience wearing thin. "Are you saying my check isn't valid?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level but failing to completely mask my frustration. The manager didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to the teller and whispered something to him. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. It was clear they were speaking about me behind my back, treating me like I was some kind of inconvenience. I waited, feeling more and more invisible by the second. It felt like they were deliberately stalling, hoping I would just give up and walk away. But that wasn't going to happen. Not today. "I'd like to speak to the regional manager," I said, my voice now firm. The manager sighed but agreed to make the call. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but it didn't matter. I wasn't leaving until I had an answer. It took what felt like an eternity, but eventually, the regional manager arrived. She was a tall woman with a no-nonsense attitude, dressed in a sleek black suit. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, and when they landed on me, I could see a flicker of recognition. "Miss Parker?" she asked, her voice unexpectedly warm. I nodded, unsure of what was happening. She extended her hand. "I'm Jacqueline Miller, the regional manager. I've been briefed on the situation." I shook her hand, trying to read her expression. There was something about her presence that felt different, less cold, more empathetic. I explained everything once again, my patience stretched thin, but my resolve still intact. When I finished, she asked the teller and manager to step aside. "Miss Parker, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Jacqueline said, her tone sincere. "I want to assure you that the problem has been fixed. There was a mistake in our system." At first I was confused. What kind of mistake? Jacqueline looked at me carefully before continuing. "The check was flagged incorrectly due to the name of the account holder. We had some issues with our database, and unfortunately, it caused an error. I apologize for the confusion." I stood there, still processing what she was saying when the pieces finally clicked together. "Who is the account holder?" I asked quietly, already suspecting the answer. Jacqueline hesitated for a moment, then answered, "The account holder is you, Miss Parker. The check is from your account." The shock hit me like a wave. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My account?" "Yes," Jacqueline said, her voice steady but filled with something else. "Respect. You are the owner of this bank, Miss Parker." The words seemed to echo in my ears, but I couldn't quite process them at first. I owned the bank? How was that even possible? Jacqueline explained further. "A few years ago I had made a significant investment in the bank during a time when it was struggling. What had started as a small stake had grown over time, eventually making me the majority shareholder and, unbeknownst to me, the owner." I could hardly believe it. The very people who had treated me with such disrespect, who had doubted me, questioned my integrity, were now in front of me, realizing they had just made a mistake they couldn't undo. The teller and manager stood in front of me, their faces pale, their arrogance evaporating in an instant. The same people who had dismissed me just moments before were now scrambling to make things right, stammering apologies. But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence hang between us, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of the moment, the power I held, not out of malice, but out of circumstance. I wasn't looking for revenge, but I knew I had the ability to change things. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "I'll have to think about what to do next," I said calmly, "but for now, I'll cash the check." I watched as the teller nervously processed the transaction, his hands shaking slightly. The manager and Jacqueline stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable. When everything was done, I took the check and walked out of the bank. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I simply felt that I had learned something important, that power can be taken away and given back in the blink of an eye. And in that moment, I chose to use my power wisely. The world may not always be fair, but I had a choice in how I responded, and for that, I was grateful.